I think you also have to remember, and this is a slightly delicate area, that the stories about and the Gospels about Jesus were written 30 to 40 to 50 years after his death. No one who wrote the Gospels actually observed any of the events that they are writing about. That's my reading of the actual stories as I look at the literature. And you don't have to worry too much about morals. You see, even chimpanzees are quite kind to each other. They can cooperate, and so can gorillas. And you don't have to have a moral sense from some supernatural being whose creation we don't understand. Evolutionists have looked at this quite clearly. People like Trivers and Hamilton have pointed out that we have in our genes, that our genes program us to behave really quite well, particularly to those who share similar genes. And there's also evidence that humans behave quite well. If you're kind to me, on the whole, I'll be kind to you. If you're nasty to me, I'm afraid I'm going to turn against you. And this makes for a perfectly reasonable moral position without any difficulty whatsoever. And if you come to all the complexity, and I mean, I know the origin of life is a tricky issue, but evolution's really very clever. No, it's not clever. It's really very dim, to put it bluntly, but it achieves remarkable results. Randomness and selection can get you to remarkable positions. This is not the moment for me to give you a lecture on evolution. But just remember, evolution proceeds very slowly. And I think that anybody thinks that God created you. What about all that evolution? You don't believe that you descended from apes? Just look at some of your friends, aren't they a bit come on. You know exactly what I mean. You must be dotty not to think that. I think for the moment, let me then just sum up again. I think the evidence for God is simply non-existent. Yes, there is some evidence for God in the Bible, but that was nearly 2,000 years ago, and I keep asking my religious friends, could you please tell me what God has done in the last 2,000 years? And there's a mumbling and a bumbling, but no answer whatsoever. Thank you very much.
Bill, 10-minute rebuttal.
You'll remember in my opening speech I said that I would defend two basic contentions in tonight's debate. The first of those was that there's no good reason to think that belief in God is false. Now, as I listened to that first speech by Professor Wolpert, I discerned basically three arguments that he gave to show that belief in God is false. The first one is that people are religious because they feel better, and that's why they believe in God. Or alternatively, it is because of the human concept of causality that leads them to believe in God. It may in fact be hardwired into their brain. Now, the problem with this sort of argument is that if you say that because belief in God is occasioned or caused in this way, therefore that belief is false, you commit an elementary logical fallacy known to every intro to philosophy student called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is trying to invalidate a point of view by showing how that view originated. And the fact that beliefs arise through people's wanting to feel better, or perhaps through causality or even being hardwired into the brain, does nothing to prove that those beliefs are false, which is what he must prove if he's to show belief in God is a delusion. For example, it's been shown by child psychologists that children have hardwired into them the belief that when an object they see disappears behind a screen and then reappears, they believe that the object continues to exist when it goes out of sight. It doesn't disappear from being and then pop back into being. This is a hardwired belief in children, and yet I think none of us would say, therefore, that belief is false. Now, the fact is that some child psychology studies do indicate that children also have such an instinctive belief in God, and I'm inclined to view this as God's provision. Now, the skeptic, like Dr. Wolpert, thinks that this is a delusion. But then if he's to justify his view, he owes us some argument to show that the belief is false. Otherwise, he's committing the genetic fallacy. So the issue tonight before us in the debate is not how religious beliefs originate, it is whether or not those beliefs are true or false. Now, he does give a second argument designed to prove that God does not exist, and that is that there's no evidence for God's existence. Well, this is not a good argument, frankly, because in the words of a forensic scientist I once met in Australia, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because there's no evidence that the butler was the murderer doesn't mean that the butler was not the murderer. Or to give a scientific example, we have no evidence so far that there was an early inflationary era in the origin of the cosmos. But woe be to the cosmologist who says because we don't have any evidence of it, therefore it did not exist. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. He needs to give a positive argument against God's existence. Now, his third argument that he offered was the simple question, who created God? Well, this is not at all difficult to answer. A timeless, eternal being cannot have a cause. As Keith Ward points out in his book, God, Chance, and Necessity, if one asks what caused God, the answer is that nothing could bring into being a reality which wholly transcends space-time and which is self-existent. To fail to grasp such an idea is to fail to grasp what God is. Moreover, I have given an argument that there exists such a being, namely my first argument based upon the beginning of the universe. It leads us to the postulation of a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and uncaused eternal being. So none of these arguments is any good that he's given us against the existence of God. If he's going to answer affirmatively that belief in God is a delusion, then we've got to see some better arguments in favor of that proposition. Now, what about the arguments that I gave? My first argument was based upon the origin of the universe, and apart from the who created God question, I saw no response to this argument in his first speech. What about the argument based upon the fine-tuning of the universe? Again, there was no response to that. But let me reinforce this argument by dealing with a possible objection that often arises. Many times people will say, well, maybe our universe is just one of an infinite number of parallel universes, a sort of world ensemble, and by chance alone we appear somewhere in the ensemble, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised at the fine-tuning of the universe. The reason this objection does not work, as pointed out by Roger Penrose at Oxford University, is that if our universe were just a random member of a world ensemble of randomly ordered worlds, then it is far, far more probable that we would be observing a vastly different universe than what we do observe. For example, the chances of our solar systems forming instantaneously by random collision of particles is about 1 out of 10 to the 10 to the 60th. Now that number is an inconceivably large number, but as Penrose says, it is incomprehensibly smaller than the improbability that the low entropy level of our universe, which is fine-tuned for our existence, should exist by chance. Therefore, if we were just one of a randomly ordered world ensemble, we should be observing a much, much smaller universe. The fact that we do not, therefore, disconfirms very strongly the world ensemble hypothesis, which suggests that we are not here due to chance. Rather, as I said, we're here due to design. My third argument was based upon moral values in the world. You remember I argued if there is no God, then there are no objective moral values. And many atheists agree with this. For example, Richard Dawkins in his recent book is quoted by Professor Wolpert approvingly when Dawkins says, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for living. Now, the problem is that is inconsistent with Dr. Wolpert's own statements of moral value, such as that religion should not interfere with the lives of others. That is a moral judgment on his part. So it seems to me he's caught in a contradiction, on the one hand saying there are no objective moral values on an atheistic evolutionary view, but on the other hand agreeing with me, and I think with most of us, that in fact there are objective moral values. Torturing a child for fun is objectively morally wrong. And if you agree with that, then I think you'll agree with me that God exists.